Here we are at the digestive system, part 12, and page 890. We're continuing with the large intestine, and we're considering now bacterial flora. The bacterial flora in the large intestine can be extremely useful, and we'll see that basically in two areas. In the nutrition chapter, we're going to be considering the fact that we get a lot of our vitamin B complex and vitamin K and other items directly from the flora. So they're very useful in this way. They're also very protective. If we have particularly Bacillus bulgaricus, which is a lactobacillus found in yogurt. I may have mentioned to you before, my mother, the microbiologist, who used to make vast amounts of yogurt for my father, who needed to have somewhat aged yogurt. The inflection curve for the growth rate for that particular bacterium is 105 degrees, and that means that the bacteria, as we get a fever, that bacteria overgrows and it actually pushes out bad bacteria. So it's protective. Is that clear? The Lactobacillus bulgaricus can grow at 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, but it actually prefers 105. So a fever, a spiking fever, will actually cause overgrowth. Moving right along, so we see here that it's synthesizing B-complex vitamins, and it's also metabolizing the water-soluble fiber. Not the insoluble, but the water-soluble fiber is being metabolized, and so that's an important aspect and maintains the colony. There is some fermentation which is going on as well. Okay, and then that brings us over here to motility, and I want to note for you, and you should remember for the rest of your life, the large intestine, besides having flora, its main function is storage, so that the flora can act upon it, the food chyme, and then propulsion. So propulsion is something we consider here, and it begins with haustral contractions. Never underestimate the importance of a healthy haustra, and if they do become, how shall I say, somewhat out of shape, how can that happen? It can happen if we lack fiber in our diet. People who persist on eating nothing but cheese and wine, for instance, will end up with problems. These days, actually, our cheeseburgers have almost no fiber in them because the wheat that is made to that is used to make the buns are actually pretty much free of fiber, and of course, meat and cheese have no fiber. So there's a lot of foods out there in our modern society that are completely without fiber, and so we could end up with diverticulosis, which is a infection of the haustras. Okay, so that brings us next to the mass movements, and there is usually at least twice a day a very large mass movement that moves things onward, and so one is expected to have a bowel movement perhaps once a day, or maybe even twice a day, if you have a very vegetable-rich diet. Okay, and then here we have various hookups of the sphincters at the anal opening, and you can check that out at your leisure. But there's some parasympathetic hookup and some skeletal hookup. Okay, that brings us now to metabolism. There's four things being metabolized. There's carbohydrates, as you can see here, and then there's going to be proteins with peptidases. There's going to be fat with lipases. There's going to be nucleic acids with endonucleases. Where our starches first metabolized is in the oral cavity, as it turns out. So we have to consider now the position of salivary amylase. Amylase is an enzyme which breaks down starch. If you were to take a bite of rice, just plain white rice, and chew it for long enough, maybe by the 50th or the 60th chew without swallowing, you might end up with something rather sweet in taste, and that's because you're developing some enzymatic action there on the starch, and you're moving it to glucose. Glucose has sweetness to it. The other place that we get the enzymes appropriate is in the pancreas, moving toward the small intestine. Okay, so, and then we break all of our starches down to these disaccharides ultimately. So lactose would be galactose and glucose. This comes from milk. Maltose comes from just the breakdown of regular starch to 2 glucoses. So we have 2 glucoses makes maltose. A sucrose, very dangerous, is made out of a glucose and a fructose. Fructose is one of the world's most dangerous things in our diet. And so it's almost equivalent, pretty close to equivalent to alcohol. It never touches the, it turns out never touches acetyl-CoA. It never enters the Krebs cycle. It never goes through the mitochondrion. It goes through acetyl-CoA pathways directly to fat. Sugar becomes fat. Okay, sugar in this case being table sugar or sucrose because it contains fructose. So beware. Okay, the protein gets broken down into amino acids. The fat gets digested and ultimately broken down into fatty acids, glycerols, monoglycerides, and so on. And the nucleic acids get broken down. And then we have our metabolism here of fat. Fat droplets get, how shall I say, emulsified with biosalt. It's sort of like adding detergent here. So basically it causes the droplets to become ever smaller until we get these micelles here. These are called, I used to think that was pronounced missiles, but it's called micelles. And so it's small enough to be metabolized by the lipases. It gets through the cellular network here. It gets, oddly enough, reconstituted to triglycerides. And we add them into these little carrier devices here called chylomicrons. And chylomicrons are specifically taken up by the lymph end vessel called a lacteal. Okay, this does not, no fat enters the capillary system at all. It goes to the lacteal of the lymphatic system. You must remember that for the rest of your life. Okay, so that's the deal right there with these items, and I'm going to proceed now on to this last phase here, which is the water absorption aspect. Approximately 9 liters of water, mostly derived from GI tract secretions, are going to be absorbed every day. And ultimately, I think if you read through this, most of the water absorption happens, 95% happens in the small intestines. So only 5% of the water is left to be absorbed by the large intestine. Beware, however, if you do not heed the call, things could get very unwet and lead to constipation. So one must be mindful of that. Okay, they talk here about various other issues of development, and so we're going to conclude our chapter right there.